Hello everyone. Welcome to the world of AI, fashion and more, brought to you by AI Aesthetic. I'm your host Duncan, and this is the show where I interview AI experts, e-commerce and fashion leaders who share their stories and insights to help you learn and grow your e-commerce business faster. So subscribe now on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, I interview Arian Ghashghai, founding and managing partner at Earthling VC. Arian is an AI engineer, investor, and entrepreneur, having worked at Meta, started his own company Rapify, and most recently founded his VC firm Earthling VC, focused on AI pre-seed investments. In this episode, we cover Arian's driving beliefs, no guts, no glory, and how this shaped his journey into computer science, AI, Meta's reality labs, and now venture capital. This is an episode filled with insight, advice, and learnings for tech entrepreneurs and engineers alike. We dive into the culture of Meta, how you should approach early investment, and how learning from failure has proved to be an accelerator for Arian's career. Enjoy. Arian, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks Duncan for having me. I think it's going to be fun. I think some good conversations ensuing. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely looking forward to it. So to kick us off, do you have a favorite quote or something that inspires and motivates you that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think I don't know how much these are necessarily quotes, so to speak, in the traditional sense, but I guess more stuff people would have heard before to some extent. Is there are two things that I think are coming from different angles of the same idea, which is no guts, no glory. It's one I like, and competitions for losers, which is a Peter Thiel quote, from 0 to 1. Reason I like those is I think from different vantage points, the idea that they're conveying is if you want extraordinary outcomes, you need to do something a little bit different, right? Like you can't basically just follow the herd, right? If you want to do something special. And I think both of those quotes, or whatever you want to call it, sayings, I think embody that. And so I think usually when I sit and I have to make a difficult decision, where particularly when the decision goes between like something that's a little bit more, maybe risky and uncertain versus like something that might be more stable. I tend to tell myself like no guts, no glory. Like, you kind of got to try the risky thing. Because again, if your goal is really to do something a little bit more out of the ordinary, it's not going to happen otherwise. I think if you do what everybody else does, right, it's the definition of mediocrity, right? Like, so, I think it's important to remind yourself of that you got to be a bit bold.
Yeah, absolutely. That's fascinating as well. And you're using that, so you're kind of drawing on it almost, these big decisions, which are,
I have to do it all the time, right? So it's not lip service, right? For me, it's very like, I can't like, because sometimes I think decision-making can be hard, right? And I think like looking at uncertainty can be scary, right? But I think to some extent, like you have to do some sort of mental trickery, right? To convince yourself that risk is actually good, right? Again, assuming that's what your success criteria is, right? It's like obviously everybody has different circumstances and right, like different risk tolerance that they can take.
yeah.
In my case, as a single guy with no debt, right? So in other words, like I don't really have any responsibility. I have, at least up for now, still all the freedom in the world to take as much risk as possible without any real major consequence, right? Like because I don't have a family I have to take care of or something like that, right? Where I have some responsibility. I don't have it at all, right? So I think particularly given that, it's like extremely extra important for me to be like, I should really be trying to take a lot of risks, right? And like just do that. And it can still be scary, right? So it's just you got to convince yourself like, oh, I'm doing this for a greater outcome, even if it's uncertain or unclear now what's going to happen with it. But got to do it, right? And so those are typically the two things that I look at is no guts, no glory, but also the competition is for losers perspective, which is again, it goes very much into like if you're just trying to go and do what everybody else is doing and copy them and whatever, like you're also kind of it's not really going to get you so far, right? And so I think those two things together can be quite motivating, at least for me. To try to do a little bit more out of the ordinary.
For sure. Awesome. Makes sense. And we'll dive into, I think it will come back to these sort of themes as we go. Now, for those that are not familiar with your expertise and background, could you tell us a little bit about, what it is you do, who's it for, what are the main problems you're solving?
Yeah, so I think a lot of this is actually kind of a full circle. So I think you can stop me if I start going a little bit too deep on this. But I think high level, I'm transitioning full time to fund management. So Earthling Ventures is the fund I'm running. Focused on, I would say the theme is two things. It's augmenting, technology that augments human capabilities in computing is kind of the theme now. The higher level philosophy to, and this also largely falls into my own personal investment strategy as an angel, is emerging technologies used for enriching the human experience effectively, right? I think particularly nowadays that's more pertinent. I think we can dive more into what that exactly means a bit later, but and so specifically that now is manifesting itself. The two things I'm very interested in are VR and AI as an investment vertical. And so pre-seed fund, basically just extending a lot of what I've been doing as an angel. And so, I was obviously a pretty active angel in these spaces before. Worked with a lot of good VCs and all of that, so kind of did pretty well there, had a lot of access there. And that was in parallel to being a machine learning engineer at Meta, which is kind of a more academic professional background. Having spent time actually working in their reality labs division for the last few years. And
oh yeah.
So that's kind of where that connection, specifically also from an operator perspective in AI, kind of as my craft, and then VR is kind of as the market came from, and I started investing in it and all of that. And I think that the reason I got into those, to kind of your question, who to do it for, I remember when you sent me the questions, I was looking at this, this is a very complicated question to answer because it depends how philosophically you want to get, right? Because I can look at it in a macro sense and be like, hey, as an investor, my more immediate first order goal, right, is to help good people build cool, great net positive companies, right? And I can say that. However, if you keep kind of expanding it, I think it to me it becomes very missionary as to why I got into these fields anyway. Because again, like right now, when I'm talking a lot about, I've done work in the AI space, or I still call it machine learning personally, but everyone calls it AI now, whatever. And kind of the extended reality space. And I think I would say over the last almost 10 years, it's like those are the two technologies that I've come across and worked in. And I started working in them because I felt that I had some engagement with them where I had this light bulb moment that these are extremely powerful computing mediums that have the potential to really change things, both in very good ways, but also if misused in very powerfully bad ways. And so it's this strong pull between net positive and net negative outcomes of these technologies. And so I always kind of felt, the reason I got into AI for example, is I started thinking a lot about what are the implications of this. This was 2014 or so, right? So it's way before any of this chat GPT stuff or whatever, where people now are starting to think about, I was still looking at pretty basic feed forward neural networks at the time, what people were doing with that, and I was like, oh, this is there's a lot you can do with this. And I started thinking a lot about it. And we could dive into some of the philosophy there, the genesis of that philosophy. But TLDR is, I felt pretty motivated to just learn those spaces quite well, because again, I was like, if you're going to contribute to the net positive aspect of it, which I'm like, this actually becomes existential, you got to know it, right? And you got to have your hands on it. You got to get your hands dirty a little bit. And so that's kind of how it started, and through different ways that kind of now snowballed into me deciding that I think me being a very early stage investor in that space is kind of the most missionary contribution I can make to that trend. If I'm also taking into account not just my background, but effectively what I think I'm better at, and also what I frankly enjoy. Kind of ended up there. So again, that was a very long-winded answer where I think there are definitely elements you can unpack, but I'll just stop there for now.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating actually. So net positive, and we'll come back to that because I think it'd be really interesting, and I'm sure our audience would love to kind of understand how you're thinking about your investments in the context of, kind of impact, I suppose. Impact metrics, and how you think about, how, I suppose, also ultimately, how will you measure your success more, at a higher level. So for sure, I'd love to come back to that, but also I'd love to just kind of going back a few steps. So you ended up at Meta, Facebook, and prior to that, just maybe help explain a little bit your journey into, because there's a journey into from computer science into AI to neural networks, and help us understand that.
To draw that bridge. So I started, so obviously like everybody else. So I went to graduated from high school, went to university, and I was actually in my freshman year, so my first year in university. I actually enrolled as a business school student, right? So I wasn't actually I would, at that point I was never really into like, oh, I'm going to do computer science, right? Like, and so um, I'd always, before even college, I had this sort of, I don't want to call it necessarily entrepreneurial streak per se, but I always like to build stuff, and so like one of the things that I did in high school, and this becomes important because this becomes part of the journey. I used to, like, for example, make beats for like music production, basically, and I used to sell these actually online and stuff. And when I was in high school, and I used to make some extra pocket money with that. And there's some local artists that I worked with at the time here in the DC area, and it was fun, and it was kind of like a bit of a personal project endeavor, like outside of my study. So I was always used to kind of doing something like this. And so when I went to university, I definitely, I don't know, I just don't think I had much of an interest in like the university like path at the time, right? I was very kind of like, I want to make stuff, right? I'm not really into socializing. I don't want to do all this kind of like typical stuff that like first year college students do, right? So I spent most of my time in my dorm room doing things, right? And so um I was very into sports at the time, and so I started sort of building this like sports news aggregator because I didn't want to go on Twitter and just search stuff, right? So it was just like a kind of a fun thing to keep my mind busy. So I started to teach myself to code that way, actually. So it's not actually, I didn't learn how to code from studying it actually initially. I just was like, all right, let me like download WordCore Press, right, and WordPress core, sorry, and try to deconstruct it and understand how to write some functional code, right? And so sort of went that way. So it's kind of self-taught. And did that in parallel, realized I hated business school and I thought it was useless and a waste of time. That was completely not my jam. So I was like, well, I started this coding thing. Let me just transfer into computer science, right? So for second year onwards, I went into computer science. And then in parallel to that, one of my friends that I started doing the music production with in high school actually went back to Europe after we graduated so I went to like a German international school. So most of the students were from Germany and all of that. And so he went back to Germany, and he kind of got a little bit of acclaim there when he went back, right? So he started building up a lot of good networks in the music industry there and all these sorts of things. And we'd always kind of talked about like the German music industry and like some of the gaps, and like particularly in like indie artist distribution. Like, again, keep in mind that this was like an era before, this was like 2013, 14ish. Before Spotify really became very like the big thing and all of that. Like, there was no real localized thing there. People were like building their own personal domains and uploading zip files of their music and trying to distribute that. It was a mess, right? So we were like, okay, I know how to code, and he has all these networks. It seems like a good opportunity now to try to like cold start one of these kind of platforms. So basically, like, we built like a streaming service for the German market. So I dropped out of school to do that full time for 2 years. And I say 2 years because we got a really hot start, actually. And I think we made a lot of mistakes in running the business. I can give you a full post-mortem on probably why that company failed, like irrespective maybe of some of the macro trends that were coming with like Spotify and all of that. But I basically, TLDR, took away from that. Like, I'm just not a founder, right? Like, I just don't have the mentality for it. And one of the detours, for example, why I say that, has actually got me into AI, specifically, which we started getting some traffic and uploads and all these sorts of things. And so we kind of realized, like, one of the not first order problems, but like second order problems that we have to deal with is our rankings crap, right? Like, you go on the site and it's just like, it's probably not organized in a good way. So I started looking at like, ranking algorithms and these sorts of things that we can do. And of course, you come across, machine learning techniques to do that, right? Like, to do, be it recommendations or whatever. And so I started reading about that, and I just kind of went down the rabbit hole from there. And like, I wasted so much irrelevant time actually on like digging into this stuff and trying to learn it, that again, I ignored a lot of other priorities that the company probably had at the time, right? And that was sort of also a signal to me that, like, I'm not sure if I can really commit to this. Like, I'm going to be heads down on one thing for like 5 to 10 years when I'm building a company and whatever. So yeah, I started questioning it then already. Didn't realize after the fact that actually this kind of intellectual curiosity would be conducive to investing, but it kind of came later. But anyway, so I wasted a lot of time. Their company failed, long story short. And so I decided that, all right, I think the best thing, I'm kind of burnt out, like it was a lot of work, right? Like I kind of want to like take my foot off the gas. So I was like, this is now I feel like I want to go have a college life, right? Like I want to go make friends and do all these sort of things.
Yeah.
And so I went back, but I also realized that I'm a computer science student. I've built a production grade system for the last 2-3 years. I really don't need them to teach me like how to write Java. So what should I do? So I basically went back and was like, yeah, I realized from my own kind of endeavor into machine learning at the time that this is like a highly academic field. And great, I'm going back to an academic institution. So what better thing to go do academia at an academic institution? So I'm going to have my fun. I'm going to kind of take my foot off the gas for a year or two and kind of recharge the batteries. But I do want to focus all of my actual concentrated time on effectively AI, right, and ML and all that sort of stuff. So I kind of weaseled my way into like graduate level courses and PhD level courses and stuff where we did basically NLP research. So like most of my stuff, my professor there for the most part was her field of interest was NLP primarily, and so a lot of it was around natural language. And so we did a lot of that. And one of the projects I did there, like research projects that we did, was detecting emotion, the intensity of emotion in tweets. Was something that we did for a PhD seminar. There was some research that we did, and so that very much combined this like social media with machine learning, NLP. It was like kind of the overlap. And I think on the back of that, I thought, oh, actually, like this was also around the time this whole Russia misinfo thing was a big deal, like 2017 and 2018. And I figured, you know what, like actually, it seems the coolest thing that I could do when I graduate now, all things considered, is go work on this stuff at a company like Facebook. It's probably like the most interesting thing I could do with this right now. And again, it already intersects a little bit with what I've been doing in terms of my research in university and all of that. So I applied for the job, I got it, right? So spent the first year there working in integrity sort of related problems, right? Like misinfo, bullying, all these sorts of things nebulous things that they talk about, downranking you and whatever, and all these things even you still have discourse about today on social media platforms. And so that's basically how I got in there. And then this whole other ship came with VR once I got there. But that's kind of the next chapter, so to speak.
Yeah, for sure. So if you look at kind of Facebook, I mean, it's incredibly successful company, has had some challenges of late. But what surprised you working, in Facebook, you came in quite fresh, right? You've come in,
It was my first ever employment, right? Because up until that point, I never even had an internship, right? Because I had an internship once and I quit after a day because I was like, I'm gonna go build stuff, right? Basically. So I quit and I ended up building this, actually the sports news aggregator that I was telling you about that somewhere. I'd never been employed. And again, I always kind of knew that like, I can't work in a conventional workplace. And right, that's another reason actually I was like very intent on like, I'm gonna go work at Facebook. And frankly, like, when I was debating when I was finishing my degree, like what I'm going to do career-wise, I didn't really have this mentality of like, I'm just going to take the best engineering job I can get. One of the serious considerations I had was like, okay, I want this Facebook job because I think culturally it might work, because I'd known some people that had worked there. And, at the time also it was very like, there's a lot of autonomy here and, there's nobody really looking over your shoulder. And, so kind of you have a lot of freedom as an employee, even as a junior employee there, which to me appealed, where I'm like, okay, I could work in a place where I'm not being like micromanaged, right? Micromanaging will not work for me. And kind of doing like, busy work is not going to work for me. Like I will quit. It's not going to work. So like the other thing, for example, like I was thinking is like, oh, like my mother had been in real estate, and I have a friend of mine like from high school that got into corporate real estate around the same time. And I was like, you know what, maybe I'll just go do this instead, right? If I don't get this Facebook job, right? So I was really not optimized for like, I want to go be an engineer. It just happened to work out that way, right? It was more about like, there's a certain experience that I want more so than a career path, if that makes sense. And but anyway, I ended up getting the thing, and I thought, it's a good offer. It's, I get to do something new. I get to move to California. It's a new life experience, right? Like, it is a cool thing to do. I've been doing it. All these is basically just aligned for me. But I think to your question about what was the biggest surprise, it kind of goes on this autonomy thing to some extent that, and mind you, the company is very different. The company that I joined versus the company today are two different companies. Like I think it's become unrecognizable to what it used to be. But back then it was like, I think I joined, there were like 26,000 employees worldwide at the time, which compared to now is obviously tiny, right? At the time I thought it was enormous, but now that looks like, wow, how is the company that small? But it was still, what I thought was really interesting is that actually it felt very startup-y in nature. Like the sort of like the teams that I worked on and stuff at the time, it was really like, yeah, we're like literally an independent group of 4 people trying to solve a very specific problem. Like, yeah, you have like, the big tech kind of like Facebook frameworks and stuff that you use, but it's like nobody's bothering you, right? Like you're kind of writing your own success, right? Like all these sorts of things, right? There's no real safety net, right? Like, and so subsequently it's very autonomous and people can do what they want, right? Like, but ultimately like your destiny's in your own hands, right? I really enjoyed that. And that was sort of like the hope I came into Facebook with at the time. And that that was also true. And again, I was actually surprised that they managed to largely maintain that kind of culture, even with 25,000 people. And I thought that was really great. Like I gave them a lot of credit for that. Like I think over the last 2 years in particular, like things have kind of changed for the worse. Not in this sense, actually. Like I think they are still pretty good about autonomy, but just the ability to iterate fast has definitely dwindled. Like there's just too much organizational bloat there now. I think where some of that startup feel in terms of like I can just build without any resistance really like kind of doesn't really exist anymore. But in terms of like, yeah, there's still no micromanagement or anything like that, which I think it's a good management style. Like I definitely think it's you're gonna get more out of ambitious employees if you kind of just let them do their thing, right? Like versus trying to tell them what to do all the time. But yeah, I think the company has different issues now. But that was to me very surprising in a positive way. But
yeah, it is surprising. I mean, like as you say, I mean, a company of 26,000 people to be able to kind of offer that autonomy, and I think that is really kind of powerful. It's motivating for individuals that really want to get on and build and achieve versus the kind of corporate. I mean, that's the kind of the risk of a corporate environment is that
100%.
Kind of,
yeah. That I think is the biggest change, right? I think the company changed from being a very startup-y like feeling environment. Again, not fully, right? But like within the 25,000 person company, like I think they did a pretty good job again of making you feel like, not a lot of resistance. You can just build, right? And you can iterate very fast. To now kind of, being more what you would like associate with like historically what people would have said about Google, right? Like, so I think to some extent, like you could say that Facebook has either graduated or degenerated, depending on how you frame it, right? To Google level, right? Like, where, it's a lot of engineers for the most part, not too much to do. That's not actually true. Like, to be honest, I think there are a lot of orgs where the people are very busy, right? So I don't want to draw that kind of sweeping generalization, but it just gets harder, right? You have more XFN to deal with, like, the planning cycles and all these sorts of things like got longer every half, right? It went from being maybe 2 weeks in my first year there to being 2 months plus now. I mean, if not more. These sorts of things, right? Where I noticed definitely that there were a lot of high performing employees that became very disenchanted with that, right? And I think rightfully so. So I think it's unfortunate. And also I think on that topic, the fact that Facebook's very aggressively cutting employees now, like, as much as, you can look at it and say, oh, these poor employees, whatever. I think from the company perspective, I give Zuck a lot of credit for that, actually, because I think it absolutely is the right thing. And I think if they really want to succeed on this whole, like, VR extended reality path, which again, I'm betting on, and I hope that they're obviously they're successful with it. I think it's good for the industry at large, of course. They have to do that. Again, it's not easy, and you're going to probably get a lot of scrutiny for doing it if you're a huge publicly traded company with 100,000 employees to like aggressively cut people even as you're printing money. But I think for the health of the company, it's genuinely the right direction. And I give them a lot of credit for pulling through with that. So I have no insider information at all on this, but like if I had to speculate, I wouldn't be surprised if when this whole cutting business is said and done that they're below 50,000 employees. Wow. Down to like 100,000, which would be over half the workforce cut. That'd be my guess, right? And I would highly support that, actually, because I think it's very good for the health of the company. So I give a lot of credit there.
Okay, so now so we kind of you're at Facebook, but then subsequently now you've gone, from being an engineer to actually making decisions and starting to invest, right? And you started, just in terms of this transition into Earthling, you've been investing personally for a little while, right? So just
That's right.
help us understand a little bit. So what prompted, let's go back to that, maybe the first investment, what was it? How did that happen? Like what prompted this? Yeah.
So I kind of knew, I think I mentioned before, right, that one of the postmortems that I had on my startup failing was that I don't think at the very least, you could say I haven't found something that gets me inspired to be heads down for 10 years. The other side of that is that I like intellectual curiosity, right? Like I like being able to look at a bunch of things, look at the macro picture, and then kind of dive in deep and, basically, let's say, execute there for a short period of time, pull out, right? And kind of do that a bit more horizontally than vertically. And I realized at some point, kind of in the years after that, that's a lot of what investing is, right? Like it's a lot of like what effective venture capitalists do. Pick trends in a market and then try to find basically winners, right? Kind of thing. It was like, to put it very crudely. So I always kind of knew I wanted to do that. Like I remember I'd like watching Shark Tank and stuff, and I'd like Dragon's Den in the UK, and be like, wow, this is awesome, right? Like I'd love to be one of those people. But of course, I thought, hey, to be one of those people, at some point I have to make a $1 billion company and sell it, right? And then I can do this stuff. So I really thought about it, and then right when COVID started, there's like literally like a week once we're into the whole lockdown and everything. Like one of my friends who is was working in private equity in New York at the time, texts me and he goes like, hey, a friend of mine reached out about investing in this company. Do you want to chat with the founder? And I'm like, yeah, like sounds great, So like, and this is actually has nothing to do with what I'm investing in now. This was like a CPG company actually. So it was also COVID, right? So me and my friend, we spent a lot of time talking to the founder, and so anyway, we liked the founder, ended up investing in him. And that was the first investment that I made, and I got really kind of involved with that because again, that's I think where I realized like I just like being an investor. Like for me, it was very fun to be like involved with trying to help. This goes because the company's super young, right? This guy was still really starting out, right? So this was some of the first capital in. Just being like a sounding board for the founder, trying to be involved. I mean, I even went to like a trade show on their behalf because the founder was Canadian and the US didn't let him in because it was during COVID. So he was in Europe, so they decided not to let him into the country. So like me and another investor went and represented the company at a trade show, and I enjoyed all of this, and so that actually spiraled into was I got known amongst some of the other investors, who were a little bit more plugged in generally into early stage investing. I was at the time of like, oh, this tech guy that wants to invest, basically, right? This like engineer wants to invest, like AI guy wants to invest. And so they started sending me companies at that point, right? So I started getting some more kind of on and off, like kind of deals in my inbox. And long story short, like I started to really enjoy that, and I just started to kind of get a little more proactive about really making that snowball, right? To the point now where again, I've gotten so much demand as an investor, and it took so much of my time as an angel, and I've enjoyed it so much, frankly. Again, that's why I think also partially why it's really grown for me as an inflow, that I decided to kind of just go be a fund manager, right? I think in between that also I got offers like especially since I started Earthling, there I've got a lot of offers along the way of like working at other funds, right? Like established funds, this sorts of thing. All of which to this point I've turned down, because it was like, hey, I have my own mission and my own thesis here, which I kind of talked about at the top of the podcast, right? About the human experience, investing in people very early. That I've been doing this in my own philosophies in Asia. I don't want to give that up, right? Like I have all the facilities to do it on my own, right? So I don't want to give up that autonomy, even if it's maybe not as lucrative or as fancy or as sexy sounding in some cases as it would be with maybe working with some of these funds. But again, it's more about doing what I enjoy, what I believe in, and so decided to keep trotting down that path as doing this kind of independently, if you will.
For sure. So you get these deals in your inbox, right? How do you start? So you've got an email from some founder, you've got an intro from my buddy in New York who says, oh, this tech guy, gotta have a look at this. So what?
It's yeah, it gets interesting because I think to some extent this is I think an important thing to do, and there's some successful fund managers that have effectively told me this as well, right? Which is like you should be spending like 20% of your time thinking about your process and generally like what you're doing procedurally, right? Like you should always kind of be questioning, like, are we doing the right? Am I doing the right thing, right? Like sort of thing. So I do want to preface by saying that this is not like anything I say now is not something that's etched in stone, right? It's a constantly evolving art, if you will, right? And you do new things happen in the market. You have different kinds of investments. It informs what you keep doing, right? It's an art, it's not a science. For me personally, I think if you're just looking very top of funnel in terms of like top of funnel management, right? Because like you can't take a call for everything that comes into your inbox. At least I can't. You try to filter on a few things. For me personally, like I do have a hierarchy of weight I would give each inbound, and so like that goes to say that like I guess for founders that are listening to it, like if you have no choice, definitely do cold outreach. It can work for sure. Like I've invested in people that have cold outreach, whatever. But there is an order of sequence that people pay attention to, right? So for me, the companies that I would weigh the most are the ones that are actually coming from my portfolio founders. So I have a founder that I've invested in that tells me, like one deal I did recently. I had a founder of mine that went into Techstars after I invested, and he met a guy in Techstars, and he was like, "Hey, I think you should talk to this guy. I think you'd really like what he's doing." Right? I ended up investing in his company, and he was right. Like I freaking loved it. Right? And it's kind of like it goes into sort of like to sound in the hip hop culture, I guess, like real recognizes real, right? We're kind of like odds are like, if I have a really good founder that I really like and really respect, like, they're probably going to intro me to people that, are of a similar kind of cut from the same cloth, right? So that's always number one. And then number two is, effectively like co-investors or downstream investors for me that would send me like, I like getting deals, for example, from bigger funds that would follow on some of my companies that are like, hey, I really like this guy and I really like what they're doing. I think you should give it a look, but it's too early for us because it's out of like stage thesis or something, right? Those can be pretty useful, particularly I think if you're thinking of it strategically from like a portfolio management perspective that, because investing is very relationship based, right? So if I'm getting something of promise from a downstream investor, odds are, there's a very non-negligible chance that I get marked up by that fund at some point because they're already building that relationship with that founder. And again, I think a lot of deals that I've seen done, particularly at larger rounds, is those founder VC relationships have actually existed for a long time. And so that's actually something that I advise a lot of founders on, is that you should constantly, if you know you're going to need venture backing, you should constantly be talking to investors, even if you're not raising. Because the more they know you and the more they see your ability to execute, the more likely they are to cut you a check, right? Like and just make that process less painful. So those are like the two main ones that I really look at in terms of like I give those high priority, like co-investors, downstream investors, founders. However, I get a lot of inbound like cold emails where I'm like, oh, this is cool, right? Like I'll hop on with them. But it's like then you start getting more into the technical stuff. It's like first and foremost, always been investing in pre-seed. Like me, I'm almost exclusively pre-seed investor. Is do I think the people building this are legit? Like, do I have confidence in the people, right? And that's also the biggest investment decision driver at the end of the day. Like, if I believe in the solution and the market that they're going after, and I think these people are just gonna, I just really believe in the competence and the ability for the team to execute.
Yeah,
that's likely what's going to drive a investment decision, right? So those are to some extent also the larger, higher level question I'm trying to answer when I get, let's say, a random inbound, right? Is like, is the pitch giving me some sort of belief that I can answer yes to that question, right? And I think there are different ways you can start like poking at it, right? Like one of it could be sheer experience. Another thing, like this is particularly true for AI, is the reason I mention this is because I get a lot of pitches now where this isn't true. Does the solution even make sense? Does the one-liner even from a very just like very base technical level even make sense, right? For example, if someone sends me a pitch for an AI company and they talk about, let's say, solving what is in nature an information retrieval problem with ChatGPT, so like an autoregressive large language model, I already know that these people don't know what they're doing, basically, right? Like immediate pass, right? So the confidence again, and that actually goes to, I don't have confidence in that team, right? Because they already demonstrated that, there's something in their execution that's just off, right? Like, which no. But to me, so it comes back to team, right? And you can start looking at like kind of like poking at the product to see like, are you getting signal, from a brief pitch about like, hey, these people have their head in the right place. They have some insight, right? That's valuable. So it's very case by case, and I would say most inbounds, I don't, even ones that I get from founders or from co-investors or whatever, I don't act on. But like founders, I'd say 90% of them I probably take a call. Co-investors, 90% of them I take a call. Inbound, maybe, I mean, I can't tell you exactly, but it's not a high percentage, but some of them I will. But yeah, I think the biggest thing, if you're a company and you're going after pre-seed investment, you gotta give that investor confidence that like these are really backable people first and foremost. I think most pre-seed investors will probably tell you some iteration of the same thing, that most of the investment decisions is just around the people.
Yeah, for sure, and particularly at the earlier, at such an early stage, right?
Yeah, the earlier, the more it's about the people, right? Like, and so that's why I think the fabric of like pre-seed early stage investors is very different, right, than like ones that are doing like growth stage, that are doing 100 rounds, like very, very different mindset and whatever. Like I can sit here and be like, yeah, I consider myself to be, I mean, verdict will be out on this in 10 years, I'm actually good at this stuff or not, right? But like, I think for right now, it's like, there's some signal that I'm like, I'm backing good people at the pre-seed stage. I know I have no clue what I'd be doing if I had to invest in, like, if my job was to invest in Series C companies, right? Like entirely, no clue, right? I don't know. Like I know for outside looking in, like, how some of it works, whatever. I don't know how to make this. Like I'm not, it gets more financial. That's not my skill set, right? I'm a technical operator by background. I've failed at a company before. I maybe have facilities to get to just bet on people more so than the financial health of a business, right? Not to say I'm illiterate in that, right? By doing this, you do learn a lot of these things, right? But like, it's not my expertise, it's not my strength, right? So subsequently, like, I'm not super interested in playing there, at least not right now, right? Like, I kind of like, it's more, hey, let me invest in what I understand, which is people, product, generally, like also by extension, you start to learn like the pre-seed, seed landscape, like, what do companies need to do well in those stages, right? You're a pre-seed company in the AI space or the VR space. You want to get to seed. What do you need to do? That sort of thing. That's what I enjoy. That's what I like. That's what I understand. That's where I invest.
Yeah, for sure. So if you think about other investors, it's interesting. Like what mistakes do investors, in your view? Because I'd be interested in your perspective on like what mistakes do investors make in assessing at this stage, evaluating opportunities. What do some people miss, do you think, in this kind of very early stage?
To give a very like general answer, and there can be a lot of reasons behind it. Because like, let's put it this way, I can give you like some things that I see some investors doing right now, like again, my standard investing in some of my spaces where I think they're making mistakes, right? But more from a technical perspective. But I think if you're kind of like a broad brush in terms of like, what I would personally say this, and I've heard again some iteration of the same thought from other co-investors that I work with and all of that. And a lot of these again are successful, very successful fund managers, like known fund managers, is investing in a team where they weren't completely convicted, like they weren't 100% like convicted of the team or the opportunity, whatever. But they tried to rationalize the investment by maybe metric points or like with their graphs that look good, right? So you have a lot of kind of objective indicators that the company is moving in a good direction. But for some reason they didn't vibe with that team. Like they just didn't feel it in their gut that this is an investment they want to be part of. But they did it anyway. What I've generically heard is people saying they often regret those kind of investments, and for one reason or the other. And like I find that true for myself also, right? Like I've certainly done some deals where again I tried to take a much more kind of objective, like I like what they're doing, I like some of the traction, the data points around it, but I don't know, I'm like 50-50 on the people doing it, but the numbers look good, basically, the some of the early signal looks good, so I'll just do it. And And sometimes I sit there and think it's like, and again, not to say that these companies have gone on and failed or anything like that, right? Or like some of them have been done okay. But I can't, to some extent, like go balls to the wall on like being a cheerleader basically for that company. Because again, there's something in my gut that's just, it doesn't give me that, it doesn't come out in that sort of same, with the same enthusiasm it would be for some of the teams where I feel really like just great about them. It makes you think again, because you're an allocator at the end of the day, where I'm like, maybe I would have preferred to actually give that capital to this other team that I passed on, where I actually just really, maybe I was more about the team, but like I really liked the team. And maybe would have rather like gone and given them money and tried to support them. Maybe would have gotten more passion out of me, right? Now I will say, like, you know, um, um, I haven't made this mistake in a long time, right? So all the founders, if any of my founders watch this, right, like, none of you that I'm talking to fall into that bucket, right? Like, I kind of tried to recognize that very early. And so all the people I'm investing in now, it's all about the team. And also from my perspective, I know what I could bring to the table as an investor now, where I think like my help is most valuable, right? Like that's actually become a very big criteria for me as well. But yeah, so I'm not, if any of my founders do watch this, I'm not, none of you guys fall in that bucket right now. It's kind of it's an older problem.
Yeah, cool. So look, I'd love to sort of and ask you a couple of questions just on thinking about we've kind of covered your journey actually, which has been really fascinating, and just thinking about lessons learned along the way. What are some of the key lessons that you've or takeaways that you think would be that you reflect on? You think, okay, how could I?
I'm gonna repeat myself. No guts, no glory. I think it's seriously, like, the reason I also keep telling myself this is not because I read it in a book and I thought to myself, you know what, this makes sense. I'm gonna keep repeating it. I think some of the best opportunities that I've had in life, whether I took them or not, like, but some of the more interesting doors that were presented to me in life were on the back of doing something kind of off the beaten path, right? Like, for example, to this day, I'm still reaping some sort of benefit from having dropped out of school, built and started a company. Even though that company wasn't successful, I remember when I was dropping, everybody was telling me that I'm insane, right? Like, for doing that. Like, they were like, fortunately my parents were understanding about it, right? Like, but I had to deal with so much conversation for the duration of me doing that company that basically, like, oh, you should go back to school, you're crazy, like you're throwing your life away, et cetera, et cetera. I can guarantee you I would have not gotten hired by Facebook if it wasn't for taking that plunge. Like, my experience, my resume wouldn't have been that compelling, right? And that wasn't my intention at the time. I wasn't saying I'm going to build a company so Facebook hires me. I just went out and built the company. I was like, hey, I have nothing to lose. There's plenty of upside if this works, right? Like, I'll learn a lot, worst case scenario. Great, like, let's just do it, right? Like, I feel good about it. And again, to this day, like, I think there's some sort of like benefit that I reap from that, because again, like, even it informs a lot of the clarity in my own life. Like I told you, like, when I started pitching people for the fund, there are a lot of people that ask me like, how do I basically, like, what makes, give us confidence, because you're doing a fund one, that you're not going to just do a fund one and want to go back and be an operator, right? Or like have that sort of itch to go do it. I'm like, because I've done it and I hated it, right? So I don't want to go back to it. And so I have mental clarity for myself, because there are a lot of younger investors, I think, that do have this sort of conflict, right? And there are quite a few of them that I know that they went to college and they started in big funds, and they actually left after a couple of years because they had this itch to go try to be part of a startup, right? They go be operators. I've done that, right? And so, again, like that, I think the fact going into this project now of like, I have complete mental clarity that this is what I want to do, and I don't have this what if in the back of my head, right? Like, this hypothetical helps a lot. Like, it helped me get the Facebook job, which subsequently snowballed into me actually having some clout to get into investing, because one of the early entry points for me to get into a lot of companies, into a lot of things, was like, there are early companies that, hey, we want a Meta guy, we're a VR company. For us, it's good signal to have a Meta logo as one of our investors, right? Like, right now, so it's this cascading effect that would have only happened because I decided to go against everybody's guidance at the time and decided, screw it, I want to drop out and start a company.
And did you have and curious, in some of the previous kind of podcasts we have guests, and they've said, look, hey, so they mentioned some mentors that were helpful along, in their career and their journey and their kind of transition, or did you, how would you describe your mentors, or who did you see? Did you see counsel at various points, or were you kind of like, this is my path, or no guts, no glory?
I mean, like, I'll say this, like, for example, where I am now as like kind of a new fund manager and all of that and thing. This is actually something I've been very I'm more sensitive to in terms of trying to surround myself with people that are in the same kind of step as me on that journey. Maybe people that are 1 or 2 steps ahead of me that I can kind of learn some of the more immediate steps from. And then, people that are 10 steps ahead of me on this trajectory, right? That really have like made it, right? And so like, like fortunately I have some of them that are LPs and stuff, right? So you can get to talk to them in that kind of way. But I've definitely tried to more proactively seek that out now, right? Because I do see the value in having that kind of being able to bounce ideas off people, and helps with you're doing a lot of uncertain things, new things, right? To just have people that have done it's a good thing to counsel from. So it's definitely something I encourage if you have the ability to do that. And the reason I do that is because I know I have networks now where I can find these people and I can connect with these people. Like when I started the company, I didn't, right? I was just like a random college student, right? Trying something completely new. Would it have been useful at the time? Absolutely, right? Like, but I just didn't have any access to it. And at the time, now I do a lot of cold outreach to people that, for example, I find relevant, but like, I know I can also get like good hits on these because I have a lot of signal to me that's like, oh, this guy is, not just a random scrub, right? Like this, guy has some reputation, some track record behind him, more viable guy to talk to, respond to a cold reach out. At the time I had none of that. So I was just like, all right, like YOLO, I'm just gonna do it, right? And it was like, I think sometimes really, I think like as much as advising is good, and I still think this is true, even though now I get a lot of counsel. For me, I'm like, I always say I'm like a method actor, right? Where like, I have to go and just break something myself to really internalize the experience, right? And like sort of the lesson learned from that. That's just like my personal style. Like I like to do that. I do agree mentorship and stuff can maybe help like avoid some pain and maybe be more effective. But I've personally always enjoyed just like failing to learn, if that makes like not failing to learn, but fail at something.
And learning from it.
That you learn something from it. But yeah, it obviously I think the thing I like about that is that one, I think you really gain more. It's one thing if someone tells you something vicariously, it's another thing you can kind of see it firsthand, right? In terms of just like how much you can say to it, how internalized it is, right? That sorts of thing. Yeah, I think it also builds important character, right, to some extent, because I think like the reality of being a founder or even being a fund manager, and I think a lot of people look at VC, they're like, oh, they they don't know anything about running business, whatever. And I always say like that maybe that's true if you're like, an investor in a big fund where you're not really participating in the actual operation. But like I can say definitely as like a solo GP building up a fund now, it's a startup, it's a business. You have a lot of the same pain points that you do as a pre-seed company, right? It's just the difference is your company is a very specialized kind of company, right? With a very specialized kind of revenue model and all of that. But it's still a startup. And like failing and getting told no and all these sorts of things is a very, very important part that you have to endure through, right? And so I do think to some extent, if you've gone through a lot of like taken a lot of L's in your career, like along the way, I think you're gonna have more of the facilities to really like persevere through that, because a lot of these things are just about perseverance, right? It's like you can deal with these trials and tribulations without getting completely discouraged from doing it, right? And I think somehow building up the thick skin to do that involves failing, right? And sometimes the best way to fail is to just say YOLO, I'm going to do it, right? Counsel or no counsel, just go head in first to whatever I'm doing, and what happens, right? Like inevitably, there's going to be probably something that goes wrong that you learn from it. I think I think every person that's hyper successful that I know has obviously gone through a lot of like failure and rejection along the way, particularly early in their career, right? Like, and so I think to build that up is actually important. You gotta do that firsthand, right? Like you can't learn that vicariously.
That's true.
It's an emotional management thing, right? You don't really understand it until you really deal with it yourself.
I agree.
So I think the long answer, the short story short in one sentence, it's like I think a balance of having good mentorship and like having people that can help guide you the right way and actually also understand you as a personality, and of kind of just like I'm going to go for it kind of mentality, and like if it fails, it fails, but I just need to try something. I think that's kind of finding that right balance for you is I think the right way to is probably the ideal way. Like how I did it, my start was probably too extreme the other way of being like, I'm gonna YOLO everything, right? Like probably not ideal, right? But I learned a lot from it, right? And so
yeah, and those are the points, those difficult moments, those are the points where you learn the fastest, the most. They're kind of springboards, aren't they? They're kind of
absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah.
Like I said, I think the best things that have even now recently, like me deciding to like I'm going to raise my own fund, the amount of opportunities that's actually presented that I didn't consider before are huge. And it literally like some of the feedback around it is actually like, yeah, these people like, yeah, obviously they respect your aptitude, right, and whatever you're doing, but like you get even more respect because of you're like kind of willing to take that step of like, hey, I'm just gonna go for it, right? Like I'm just gonna go take that plunge, right? Like particularly now, like let's say, oh, you have big tech salary, all these sorts of things, big security blanket, and to just kind of say like, I'm gonna throw all of that away and forego all these opportunities basically to like go do my own thing. Gets respect from a lot of people. And again, you'd be surprised. It all comes down to people at the end of the day for me would look at someone like that and be like, wow, we want that guy to work for us. Like that's the kind of personality that we want. And again, that only comes off the back of like having sort of the guts to say, I'm going to jump into just a pool of uncertainty and see what happens, right? Like I'm going to bet on myself. Again, I've never done. Anytime I do something like that, there's some sort of positive effect, even if I don't reach the outcome that I wanted to when I set out on that mission. It just opens a lot of doors, right? And so again, that's why I said the first thing is like the most important, like the quote I live by is no guts, no glory, competitions for losers, right? Like it's the same. There's a reason for that, right? It's not from a book; it's from my own, granted, very short but life experience.
Yeah, experience. Yeah, for sure. Well, I'd love to keep chatting with you. We've got to move on to our quick fire round. So, and I've got a few questions.
I like chatting your ear off with a lot of these things, but you got me going.
It's awesome. Yeah. So, tell me, quick fire round. We're going to ask you a series of quick questions. Love to hear your kind of instinctive reaction, right? So, on a few things. So yeah, first up, what book would you recommend to our audience to go and read, and why?
Yeah, I think I alluded to it at the top of the podcast, but 0 to 1. And I know I'll take a lot of heat for that. That's fine. But the reason I say this is, I think there are a lot of interesting books that I've read where it's like, oh, this is interesting in terms of just the substance of it and some of the insight. Yep. 0 to 1 personally is the only book that I've ever read that really kind of made me sit there and think like, wow, this is really like informing a lot of just the very core framework of how I think about stuff, right? Like particularly, so I had this very kind of like underlying philosophical, it's almost like I almost consider 0 to 1 more of like a philosophical book than like a business book to some extent, because it's, to me, it's the real kernel of it is, I think, not the substance of what he says, but the manner in which he thinks about things, if that makes sense, right? So sort of the thought processes that are presented in that book, to me, was more interesting again than some of the details of like the details of what he talks about doesn't actually stick with me, right? It's just more like, how he thinks about the world, like in a very kind of like more philosophical way around, like, how do you divide the world, like how do you define certain things that happen, right? Certain processes, etc. Subsequently, what's the most beneficial way for you to act in it, right? Like in these sorts of things. And it's like, let's put it this way. I started the streaming service startup that I mentioned on the back of reading 0 to 1. Like, that was actually an inspirational thing for me to say, we should do this after reading that book, right? So it's the only thing I've read that had that sort of impact. So maybe I overvalue it because it has emotional value for me, but I reread it all the time. And this is such a great book. It's like, I know I'll take crap from it from some of the listeners and stuff, but I'm gonna die on that island. I'm good with
it. So what's your favorite AI tool? What do you?
PyTorch.
Okay.
That's gonna be a very engineer answer, but
yeah, exactly.
But the reason for that is I used to build machine learning systems in a world pre PyTorch.
Yeah.
So with all my work at Facebook, I've been using PyTorch. It's just like I think what a lot of people don't see is it's such a great framework that, like, OpenAI and all these kind of like bigger research labs that are building ChatGPT and stuff, they're building it on, as far as I know, they're using PyTorch, right? Tesla uses PyTorch for their self-driving stuff and whatever. So, maybe I'm sure they would have been more creative, but like, I think to some extent, I'm gonna sell the narrative that like PyTorch helped facilitate the creation of some of these systems. And so we wouldn't necessarily be where we are today if it wasn't for PyTorch existing. Now, the flip side of that argument is that there are alternatives, right? Okay, they would have just used TensorFlow to do it, which is probably true. But you know, I freaking love PyTorch, and you know, it's like it made my machine learning adventure a lot more fun. And you know, so I'm gonna just completely homer it there and be like PyTorch.
I know some of my team would agree with you. So you're it's not.
Yeah.
So what's the favorite? What's your favorite item of clothing that you own?
I have this Scuderia Ferrari. It's not like a bomber jacket, but it's like a kind of a thick, like, you know, sport jacket, like zip sport jacket. I freaking love that thing. From the I think it's from the 2016 season. I'm a big like Formula One Scuderia Ferrari fan, you know, so you know, naturally I'm inclined to just like a lot of the Ferrari gear, and like I just really love that jacket. So anytime the weather's perfect, the first thing I do is I throw that jacket on, you know. So got to be that. It's definitely got to be that.
Nice. So what's an interesting fun fact that people will not know about you?
I think in these contexts, right, in terms of very technical and investor and those sorts of things, that I speak, what is it, at least 6, 7 languages, you know, at least at like very proficient conversational level, you know, and it's a very big, actually a lot of my non-business hours are spent in these sorts of domains. Like I really like language, I really like, you know, culture, reading a lot about particular similarities of culture and that sort of thing. It's like something I like a lot. So you know, I've mentioned it in passing to some people that I work with, and there's just like kind of interesting reaction to when that comes up. So I'd say, yeah, that's probably like a very big part of my personality, actually, that you know is completely non-obvious from, you know, these kind of conversations that we've been having.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Arian. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun. Really interesting, really insightful. If people want to get in touch with you, how should they do that?
Twitter is probably the best. I like live on Twitter. You know, so actually asked my favorite AI tool. I was actually I almost said Twitter because I'm like, well, the whole thing is filled with AI, right? You know, which you don't necessarily see, but you know, all these systems are running on the back of machine learning models. But yeah, Twitter is the best, which is just like my first name underscore last name, which I'm not gonna, if I say it, nobody's gonna get it anyway. So maybe if you put in the show notes.
I'll put the show notes, yeah.
Yeah, it's probably easier, but yeah, Twitter, I usually read all of my DMs and stuff and all of that. So, you know, not that famous. So yeah, you know, if anybody wants to connect, obviously super happy to do it through Twitter and then kind of move from there.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. And
yeah, no, thanks for having me. Like, the questions were great. Maybe I talked a little bit too much on some of them, but you know, if it's useful for your audience, I'm happy. So, yeah,
thoroughly enjoyable and really insightful. So thanks so much, and I'll speak to you soon.
Yeah, appreciate that. Thanks, Duncan.